histograms, luminosity, and color. Luminance histograms are more accurate actually than the RGB histograms that we've been looking at, because the luminance histograms describe the perceived brightness, the distribution, or the luminosity within an image. Although the RGB histograms are most commonly used, they're the most common histogram, these other types are more useful for specific purposes. So in this lesson, we're going to look at how luminosity and color both vary within an image and how this can be seen in a histogram. Color histograms represent an image that is grayscale. It's a grayscale representation of how the color's intensity is distributed throughout the image. So it's looking at one specific color channel. Look at this example. I want you to pay particular attention at how each color changes the brightness distribution within the image and how the colors within each region influence its brightness. Luminance histograms are more accurate than the RGB histograms at perceiving or describing the perceived brightness distribution, or we call it the luminosity within an image. Our human eye is more sensitive to green light than to the red or the blue light. And so what this ends up showing is that the luminosity histogram is probably the closest to the green histogram, more than any other color. The luminance histograms are more accurate than the RGB histograms, like we mentioned, at showing that brightness distribution, or what we say the luminosity within the image. Each pixel is converted so that it represents a luminosity based on weighted average of the three colors at each pixel. And so when we talk about RGB, we have the red, the green, and the blue. We said that green is most closely associated to our human eye. So the weighting assumes the following, that green is at 59% of the perceived luminosity, red at 30%, and blue at 11%. So when we look at a luminosity histogram, basically the luminosity is produced by counting how many pixels are at each brightness, whereas the RGB histogram counts the value of that specific color, where that specific color is at. One thing to note, we're using the word luminance and we're using the word luminosity, and they actually are two completely separate words. They have two separate meanings. However, when we're working in Photoshop and many other programs, they tend to combine them as though they are one thing. Luminance actually is the absolute amount of light that's emitted by an object per unit area. That's what luminance actually is. And luminosity is the perceived brightness of that object by a human observer. So although we're using the words luminance and luminosity as one, they really are two separate things. Luminance is the amount of light emitted per unit area, and luminosity is the perceived brightness by a human. Taking a look at this example. So if you look at the image, it's got multiple colors in it. When you get to the core of each one of those color shapes, those color blobs, I guess you could say, the intensity of that specific color reaches 255. So if you look at the green, the very center of that green is at 255. Red, same thing, and same applies to the blue. So if you looked at the RGB histogram, you would see significant clipping occurring. That would indicate that our image is significantly overexposed. It's blown up. In the luminosity histogram, you would see something quite different. The relative horizontal position of each peak that we see in the luminosity histogram is in accordance with the percentage that's used in that weighted average for calculating luminance that we mentioned previously. 59% green, 30% red, and blue 11%. Now look at the luminosity histogram. Blue is at 11%, red is at 30%, and green is at 59%. So this luminosity histogram tells us that there is 0 pixel count in that upper portion, which means that there really is no white. It also tells us there is no full black anywhere by looking at the left side of the luminosity histogram. So there are no pixel counts on the far left or the right, which tells me there are no blacks, there are no whites. So the RGB histogram significantly shows a different picture. So the rule here, really the more intense and pure the colors are in your image, the more a luminance and RGB histogram will differ. So the RGB histogram produces those 3 independent histograms, and then what it does is it adds them together. So when we see the composite histogram, the RGB histogram, it's taking the red, it's taking the green, it's taking the blue, and it's adding them together. And it's not thinking about whether or not each color came from the same pixel. So here, the 2 histograms illustrate the point that they can interpret the information completely differently. So if we once again take a peek here at what we would see with the red, the green, and the blue channel in this graphic, you would see extreme clipping happening on the red channel, on the green channel, and on the blue channel. And like I mentioned, this would say, hey, this photo is really overexposed. But there are no pure whites, there are no pure blacks. And so that luminosity histogram shows a completely different picture. No pixels anywhere are at full brightness. And so we see again those peaks, 59, 30, and 11%. So if we cared about color clipping, then the RGB histogram would clearly warn us of that, and that's the one we'd want to pay attention to. So the RGB and the luminance histograms are potentially going to give you different results, and we need to understand though that each does have its good use. There's a use for each of them. We're not going to just say RGB lies and we're not going to look at it, because we can tell if there's color clipping occurring in one of our color channels. So the general rule of thumb here, obviously the more intense and pure the colors are in your image, the more a luminance histogram and the RGB histogram will differ, and you need to understand and know that that will occur. If we look at this example, and now we look at the histogram here, we see some pretty intense red. There's some pretty bright red here. So the regions where the individual color channels are being clipped, like the red, basically we could potentially lose all the texture caused by that particular color. So we could say it's kind of blown out, it's clipped. The red areas, we don't have any texture in that 255 red area. However, we can't rule out what information is on the green and the blue channel. So the luminosity is not going to be clipped if there is color information from the other channels, the green and the blue. So when you're editing, when you're looking at photos, understand that we're not just living in a single channel world. We have red and we have green and we have blue. And what we're looking at as far as the histograms in the red, green, and blue are a bit different than what we see in the luminosity histograms.